So thank you to ICMA, thank you Simon, for the invitation to share some thoughts. Today it's going to be on the sovereign transition, and it won't be that wild. It'll be more on the academic side, so apologies if I disappoint in that sense. It's amazing to see so many old and new faces here for us who have been in the green bond markets since the start. It's really amazing to see how it actually grows. I'm going to do a speech here which unfortunately comes in front of two fantastic and very intimidating panels, and I'm actually going to be in one of them, but they are quite unscripted, and they will probably criticize some of the ideas that I'm going to mention here, so just a caveat with that. In my defense, AFII, Anthropocene Fixed Income Institute as an organization, we're not that focused on principles or standards or taxonomies. We're much more focused on the day-to-day workings of portfolio managers, how they actually rechange these ideas into actual trades. So on the next, during the next 10 to 12 minutes, I will try to reflect a little bit about sovereigns, transition, and the probabilities thereof. That will have to do a lot in terms of thinking around what is a robust transition, how likely are we going to be to effectuate that, and how might the probability of that actually happening ebb over time as things in the macro environment and other things also change. So coincidentally, actually, my PhD thesis once upon a time was on a theme of time-varying transition probabilities in regime switching models. So it's quite close to this. So let's start with some numbers on the obvious. When it comes to driving the global climate transition, government debt and government bond markets are obviously a very clear component. In terms of the market capitalization, they are pretty much on par or bigger in many jurisdictions compared to public equity markets. Despite this, I think that the environmental finance community has focused a lot in terms of public equities rather than on governments. But governments are critical. If you think about some of the big emission sources actually come out of national oil companies, state-owned enterprises, and so on. And policies are driven by government. So the engagement, the transition planning from government, and how we as investors engage with them around that is crucial. For example, the single biggest emitter of Scope 3 emissions has roughly 5% of global total emissions. They owned by or controlled up to 97.5% by their government. And that is a government that is quite keen on raising debt financing. Getting that transition equation and engaging on that is extremely important. So one of the things when we're here with the principles, we define what the target and so on is. But we also have to consider the probability of success. There's simply a lot of uncertainty of whether we are going to be successful in the plans we set out with. So the Bloomberg survey on this slide is a survey of 250 large cap CEOs, and only 33% of those CEOs think that their peers will actually achieve their net zero targets, whereas their own self-confidence is that at least 57% of them believe that they themselves will actually achieve it. Now, it's a little bit like the I'm better than the average driver out there, to which everyone, or 80% of the population says, yes, I'm better than the average. The same sort of logical inconsistency. And if you're an investor, and if you're investing in these 250 companies, you simply have to say a net zero target or other decarbonization target is not enough. I have to assign a probability that they are actually going to achieve it. So let's now take this to a sovereign perspective. The graph here shows carbon emissions of a large industrial nation that has set some NDCs, pretty ambitious targets in terms of decarbonization, minus 46% up until 2030. There are very detailed plans on how to get there, but what the graph tries to illustrate that there is still, even if the target is there, there is a small sort of probability distribution around that. Because the outcome there is going to be, the plan, the deterministic part. There's also a lot of randomness, stochastics. To paraphrase the Mike Tyson, the great boxer, everyone has a transition plan until they get punched in the face. it is all the random things that happen. You know, the development of SMRs, solid-state batteries, a Trump election win, a 6% rise, as was reported yesterday, in terms of flaring and associated methane leakages. All of these things will actually affect the sort of the outcome in terms of this, not specifically on this issue, but still. One issue arises here. It's very hard, a priori, to, or even ex post, to determine what is deterministic and what is stochastic. There might be a random event that affects some of these outcomes that will be on the positive side. You know, we find, you know, solid-state batteries. That will usually be then claimed by issuers to be a deterministic, something that was part of the plan, whereas the randomness on the downside will be explained as something that is not, something that is stochastic. So in this way, I do think that there is a very sort of good analysis to be done around how do we think about this distribution? Is it symmetric? Is it fat-tailed? Is it skewed in any ways, shapes, or forms? Let's make some examples of this. So there we go. Technological and unanticipated structural changes can make decarbonization plans or transition plans obsolete faster than we anticipate. So this is a picture for 2015, 300 kilometers from here, where the Swedish government, together with the Germans, opened up a new hard coal-fired power plant in Moorburg, outside Hamburg. It was supposed to be fed with Russian seaborne coal. It shut in 2021, but it was claimed to be a part of a transition play back in 2015 because it was hard coal that was going to replace lignite, which is, you know, the hard coal is much more carbon efficient than lignite. Now, this just illustrates, if we look 10 years forward, how much can have changed if we look at what happened over the past 10 years. So there is definitely upside, and I believe in technology. We can decarbonize quicker than we thought, and that's the sort of the downside or the right-hand side of this distribution function that I was showing in the other slide. Another thing to be very cognizant of this year and going forward is the effects of the electoral cycle. We're talking sovereign debt issuances here. The likelihood that we will have a less conducive in terms of decarbonization policies in place over the next couple of years is pretty high. We've seen this in Scandinavia, where one of the new, quote-unquote, Scandinavian governments lowered the prices of oil and petrol because that was part of their election policies. That locks in lots of ICEs being bought now and their cumulative emissions over the next couple of decades. That is something that sort of moves the likelihood of us hitting the targets the wrong direction. Lastly, and not shown in this slide, well, obviously there will be lots of other types of forces affecting the stochastics, but you will also have the unknown unknowns in some sense. And to paraphrase Evander Holyfield, if you don't know him, he was an opponent of Mike Tyson, everyone has a transition plan until Mike Tyson bites off your ear. So we're going to talk a little bit more on bond pricing. How do these forces potentially affect investors? Well, we have an instrument, the sustainability-linked bond. And you can go through all the equations. You can even download a book on it if you go up and take the QR code there. Hint, hint. But essential to the SLB equation, pricing equation, is the probability to step. Everything else is deterministic once you sort of set the deal. So if you take a very basic example, you have an SLB paying out $1 in net present value of future coupon step-ups. And there's a 50% probability that that step-up will happen. Then that's worth 50 cents. I, as an investor, I'm happy to buy that at a price of 50 cents or less. Now, then we tie this to the probability. If I think that the probability that a step up is actually quite higher, 75%, well then, you know, buying it at the option at 50 cents is quite cheap. And vice versa, if I think it's lower, then it looks quite expensive. But what is important here is that we can use these equations to actually back out the probability to step. And if that step is quite closely related to the success of transition, then we are very close to something, which is the final left field idea that I'm coming up with here today. A sovereign SLB bond in twin format. So, historical note, I have a certain affinity for twin bonds. 4 years ago, I wrote a paper on twin bond structures. Coincidentally, a couple of months before the German government issued the first twin green bond. There was no causality in between, I think. But twin bond pair is simply two bonds that trade, that have similar structural features, and you can sort of derive the greenium or other features of the labeled bond in comparison there. So the green bond gives us a perfect laboratory to think about the greenium. But if you go back to the previous equations on the SLBs, we know that we can back out the transition probability, or the probability to step, directly from the relationship between the price of the bond and the equivalent vanilla bond. So if we have them in a twin bond format, in a sovereign bond framework, and it's tied to the transition success, we can directly from market back out implied probabilities of transition. That makes me extremely excited. I think it's, that would be a beautiful bond, probably the most beautiful bond we have ever seen. The premium can, of course, vary over time, and I'm illustrating that in a graph where I say I use a fake example where the option premium goes up and down, and essentially you back out the implied probability that what investors perceive the option to be worth, and in terms of the probability of the issuer hitting their targets. So imagine if we had a portfolio of government bonds where we had these types of links, and we could actually measure on each of them what the market assessment was in terms of transition success or not. Now, there's a couple of structural things to consider in this, but we could delve into that in separate discussions. Finally, I want to just highlight a few final points after that idea. I've borrowed the left-hand graph from the METI and their work on transition finance. I think it's an extremely useful graph to think about green bonds, transition bonds, and sustainability-linked bonds. And that discussion will be held in the upcoming panels. Finally, as we're in the Netherlands, we wrote a piece in the eye of the A-holder earlier this year, where we highlighted the triple tranche issuance of Ahold, supermarket chain here out of the Netherlands. And it sort of illustrates one of the ideas we believe in when it comes to labeled bond issuance. Vanilla bonds for the very short end, use of proceed bonds for the intermediate term, where you can define your assets and you know what they're going to do pretty well. And then further out on the curve, you look at the more outcome-focused type of instruments where you see much more stochastics. So that concludes. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.